What if the waitress of Billionaire mocked every single day? Was the one person with the power to destroy everything he'd built on lies? What if her quiet smile hid a PhD mind collecting evidence of crimes that could send him to prison? In Lagos's most exclusive club, a man who thought himself untouchable learned that brilliance doesn't announce itself. It waits, watches, and strikes when the moment is perfect. This is Elmaram Stories, where African folktales meet real-life lessons that will change how you see the world. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's begin. The crystal chandeliers of the Eco Crown Club cast golden light across white marble floors, creating shadows that danced like secrets waiting to be told. Amara Okie moved through the dining room with practiced grace, her uniform crisp, her expression carefully neutral. She carried champagne to table 7, where Chief Tun Balagan held court like a king surveying his kingdom. "Ah, the simple waitress," Balagan announced loud enough for nearby tables to hear. His laughter boomed across the room. "Tell me, girl, do you even understand what we discuss here? Stock portfolios? International investments?" His guests, politicians, businessmen, society wives, joined his laughter. Amara set down the champagne bottle, her hands steady. She said nothing. She never did. But behind her dark eyes, something else was happening. Something Balagan would never suspect. 3 years earlier, Amara had been someone different. A Cambridge PhD candidate specializing in urban development and property law, her thesis nearly complete, her future brilliant. Then came the phone call that shattered everything. Her father, Chukwudi Okoye, had died. Heart attack, they said. But Amara knew better. Hearts don't simply stop. They break under the weight of injustice. Her father had been a principled landowner, a man who believed in honest business and fair dealing. His pride was Okoye Heights, a property in prime Victoria Island that he'd built from nothing. Then Balagan came with documents, lawyers, and police escorts. Forged signatures. Falsified deeds. Courts that moved with suspicious speed. Within months, Chukwudi Okoye lost everything. Within a year, he was dead. Amara returned to Lagos for the funeral, but Cambridge seemed impossible now. Her mother needed care. The legal bills had consumed their savings. So she did what she had to do. She found work at the one place where Balagan spent his evenings, never imagining the waitress pouring his wine once held documents from one of the world's finest universities. "More champagne for the gentleman," Balagan commanded, waving his hand dismissively. "And try not to spill it this time. Though I suppose that's asking too much from someone of your station." Amara refilled his glass, her face a perfect mask. But her mind was recording every word. Because tonight, like every night for the past 18 months, Balagan was talking business. And tonight, like every night, he believed himself too important to notice the help. "Atlantic Pearl Plaza will be my masterpiece," Balagan told his guests, spreading architectural renderings across the table. 40 stories of luxury apartments on the Lekki waterfront. The politicians are already on board. The approvals are guaranteed. This time next year will be the most talked about development in West Africa. Amara collected empty plates, moving slowly, deliberately. She'd learned to be invisible. Invisible people heard everything. "What about the wetlands?" one guest asked. "I heard environmental groups protesting." "Handled," Balagan interrupted with a wave. "Money makes problems disappear. The conservation reports will say what we need them to say." Honorable Colonel Adeyemi sits on the planning committee. A reasonable man. Very reasonable. He tapped the side of his nose knowingly, and the table erupted in knowing laughter. Amara's pulse quickened, but her expression remained unchanged. She'd heard that name before. In her father's last days, when he still had fight left in him, he'd mentioned Adeyemi. A fixer. A man who made impossible approvals possible. Later that night, after the club closed and Amara scrubbed tables in the empty dining room, she pulled out her phone. For months, she'd been documenting. Every conversation. Every careless boast. Every name dropped. Every deal mentioned. Her small apartment had become a war room. Walls covered with newspaper clippings about Balagan's empire, timelines of his projects, lists of names and connections. She'd thought about going to the police a dozen times. But police could be bought. Journalists could be silenced. She'd watched it happen to her father. No, if she was going to act, the evidence had to be perfect. Undeniable. the kind that couldn't be buried or bought. Atlantic Pearl Plaza. Something about this project felt different. Bigger. More vulnerable. Amara opened her laptop, a battered thing she'd kept from Cambridge, and began to search. The Lekki Conservation Wetlands were protected habitat, home to endangered species and critical to flood management. Yet Balogun's development sat right on the edge, possibly encroaching. The environmental impact assessment filed with the government was suspiciously brief. 3 pages where there should have been 30. She cross-referenced the names on the approval documents. 4 officials had signed off. 3 had received consulting fees from Balogun's companies in the months before approval. The paper trail was thin, but it was there. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ngozi, another waitress and the closest thing Amara had to a friend at the club. Chief left his briefcase in the private lounge. Security asked us to check for valuables before locking up. Amara's heart hammered. She texted back, "I'll handle it." The private lounge was empty, dim, smelling of cigars and expensive cologne. Balogun's briefcase sat on the leather sofa, still unlocked. Amara's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, contracts, financial projections, letters on government letterhead, and something else. A small digital recorder. She'd seen Balogun use it before, capturing voice memos to himself. Reminders. Ideas. Things he was too important to write down. With shaking fingers, Amara pressed play. Balogun's voice filled the silent room. Meeting with Adeyemi confirmed. 5 million naira to push the Atlantic Pearl approvals through planning committee. Cash, as usual. He wants it before next Tuesday's vote. Greedy bastard, but effective. Amara stopped breathing. This was it. Direct evidence of bribery. Not hearsay. Not rumor. Balogun's own voice. She pulled out her phone, connected a cable, and began transferring the file. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. If anyone walked in now. The transfer completed. She disconnected, closed the briefcase, and walked out of the lounge as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Over the following weeks, Amara became a ghost with a mission. She cross-referenced property records at the Lagos State Land Registry during her days off. She contacted former colleagues from Cambridge, asking careful questions about environmental law and fraud prosecution. She built spreadsheets comparing Balogun's public claims. 5,000 jobs created. Affordable housing for Lagos families. Against the actual plans, which showed luxury units priced beyond the reach of ordinary Nigerians. She discovered that Atlantic Pearl's financial projections assumed apartment prices that were 40% higher than comparable developments. Unrealistic. Designed to lure investors with impossible returns. It was a house of cards. But the most damning discovery came from a young environmental scientist named Chidi, whom she found through an activist network. He'd been part of the original assessment team for the Atlantic Pearl site before being removed and replaced with more cooperative consultants. The development will destroy critical breeding grounds, Chidi told her over coffee in a quiet Yaba cafe, his voice tight with frustration. The original assessment would have blocked the project entirely. But someone paid to make that report disappear. Will you testify to that? Amara asked. Chidi hesitated, fear flickering across his face. Against Balogun? That man destroys people who oppose him. I know, Amara said quietly. He destroyed my father. Something in her voice made Chidi look up. Their eyes met. After a long moment, he nodded. The investor and community presentation for Atlantic Pearl Plaza was scheduled for the first Saturday in November at the Eco Hotel. Balogun had spared no expense. It was part sales pitch, part celebration of his own greatness. Investors, government officials, journalists, and community representatives were all invited. He wanted everyone to see his triumph. Amara secured an invitation by claiming to work for a community development blog. No one questioned a quiet young woman with a press badge. The ballroom was magnificent. Giant screens displayed renderings of Atlantic Pearl in all its imagined glory. Balogun stood at the podium, resplendent in traditional abaya, commanding the room with the confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, he boomed. Today marks the beginning of Lagos's transformation. Atlantic Pearl Plaza will create thousands of jobs, provide housing for our growing middle class, and establish Nigeria as a destination for international investment. The audience applauded. Cameras flashed. Balogun smiled. Then Amara stood up. Chief Balogun, she called out, her voice cutting through the applause. I have a question about your employment figures. Heads turned. Balogun squinted into the lights, trying to place the voice. "The jobs you're promising," Amara continued, walking toward the front, her press badge visible. "Your presentation claims 5,000 permanent positions. But your actual construction and staffing plans, filed with the Ministry of Labor, show only 800 permanent roles. The rest are temporary construction jobs that will end when the building is complete. Would you care to explain that discrepancy?" The room went silent. Balogun's smile faltered for just a moment. "I don't know where you got such information, but I have the documents," Amara interrupted, her voice steady. "I can project them right now if you'd like. Along with your environmental clearance, which was approved based on an assessment that was 3 pages long. The original assessment, the one that would have blocked your project, was 37 pages and concluded that Atlantic Pearl would destroy protected wetlands. That report vanished after the original environmental team was replaced." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Journalists pulled out notebooks. Government officials shifted uncomfortably. "This is absurd," Balogun sputtered, his composure cracking. "Who are you two?" "I'm someone who's been listening," Amara said. "Listening to your private conversations. Watching you bribe officials. Documenting your fraud. And I have proof." She pulled out her phone, connected it to the presentation system with help from a confused AV technician, and pressed play. Balogun's own voice filled the ballroom. "Meeting with Adeyemi confirmed. 5 million naira to push the Atlantic Pearl approvals through planning committee. Cash, as usual." The room exploded. The ballroom descended into chaos. Journalists surged forward, cameras flashing like lightning. Government officials scrambled for exits. Investors shouted questions over each other. And at the center of it all stood Chief Tund Balogun, his face drained of color, his carefully constructed world crumbling in real time. "Turn that off," Balogun roared, lunging toward the podium. But the damage was done. The recording had played long enough. His own voice, his own words, his own confession of bribery, captured and broadcast to everyone who mattered. Security moved to grab Amara, but the journalists formed an inadvertent barrier, all of them demanding she answer their questions. "Who are you? How did you get this recording? What other evidence do you have?" Amara's hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. "My name is Amara Okoye. 3 years ago, Chief Balogun used forged documents to steal my father's property, Okoye Heights. The legal battle destroyed my father's health and ultimately killed him. Since then, I've been documenting Chief Balogun's business practices. What you heard today is just the beginning." She pulled a USB drive from her pocket and held it up. "This contains 18 months of evidence. Financial records showing inflated projections to mislead investors. Environmental reports that were falsified or buried. A list of officials who received payments from Balogun's companies days before approving his projects. And voice recordings of him discussing bribes, fraud, and manipulation." A distinguished woman in the front row stood up. Amara recognized her as Mrs. Folake Adewale, chairman of the Lagos Environmental Protection Agency. "Young woman, these are serious allegations. Are you prepared to submit this evidence to the proper authorities?" "I am," Amara replied. "I'm also prepared to testify in court. And I'm not alone. The original environmental assessment team is willing to come forward. Victims of Chief Balogun's previous land acquisitions are ready to speak. We've been waiting for the right moment. This is it." Balogun finally found his voice, though it shook with barely controlled rage. "This is a setup. A vendetta by a bitter, delusional girl who can't accept that her father was a failed businessman. You're all being manipulated." "Then explain the recording," Amara interrupted, her eyes locked on his. "Explain why Honorable Colonel Adeyemi's bank account shows a deposit of 5 million naira 2 days after that voice memo was recorded. Explain why the deposit came from a shell company registered to your nephew. Explain why that same nephew received a consulting contract from Atlantic Pearl Plaza worth 20 million naira for services that were never rendered." The color that had drained from Balogun's face now returned as dark red anger. "You have no idea what you've done. Do you know who I am? The people I know? I will destroy you the same way He stopped abruptly, realizing his mistake. "The same way you destroyed my father?" Amara finished softly. The ballroom had gone silent again. "Thank you for confirming that on camera." Indeed, every major news outlet in Lagos had cameras rolling. This would be the lead story on every channel by evening. Honorable Colonel Adeyemi, who had been sitting near the back trying to appear inconspicuous, suddenly stood and headed for the exit. "Stop that man," someone shouted. Two Economic and Financial Crimes Commission officers, who had attended the presentation as part of a routine check on large investments, moved to block the door. Everything happened quickly after that. Mrs. Adewale made a phone call, and within 20 minutes, the ballroom was filled with EFCC agents, environmental regulators, and senior police officers. Balogun was informed he could not leave Lagos pending investigation. Adeyemi was detained for questioning. The Atlantic Pearl Plaza project was immediately suspended, but Amara barely registered any of it. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. She'd done it. After 18 months of silent service, of swallowing humiliation, of watching Balogun mock her while she gathered the evidence to bring him down, she'd actually done it. "Miss Okoye?" A gentle hand touched her arm. She turned to find an older man in traditional attire, his face kind but serious. "I'm Chief Adebayo Williams, former Supreme Court Justice. I knew your father. He was a good man. What you did here today took extraordinary courage." Amara's eyes stung with sudden tears. "I just wanted justice for him." "You've done more than that," Chief Williams said. "You've exposed corruption that goes far deeper than one man or one project. But I must warn you, Balogun has powerful friends. The coming months will be difficult. You'll need legal protection, possibly even physical protection. Do you have representation?" Amara hesitated. She'd been so focused on gathering evidence, on planning this moment, that she hadn't thought beyond it. "No, sir." "Then allow me to help. Pro bono, of course. Consider it repayment for the injustice done to your father." Over the following days, Lagos exploded with the scandal. The recording played on every news channel. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the waitress who exposed a billionaire. Social media erupted with hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Amara, hashtag Balogun exposed, hashtag Waitress Warrior. But behind the public frenzy, darker currents moved. Amara received threatening phone calls, voices promising violence if she didn't withdraw her statements. Someone tried to break into her apartment. Chief Williams arranged for her to stay in a secure location, a friend's compound in Ikoyi with 24-hour security. Her mother, Adiz, visited her there on a Tuesday evening. The older woman looked fragile, worn down by years of grief and struggle, but her eyes held something Amara hadn't seen in a long time: pride. "Your father would be so proud," Adiz whispered, holding her daughter's hands. "But I'm frightened for you, NWAM. These are dangerous men." "I know, Mama. But we can't let fear win. Not anymore." Adiz was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her handbag and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a young Chukwudi Okoye standing in front of a half-constructed building, Okoye Heights in its early days. His smile was broad, his eyes full of hope and determination. "He built that with his own hands," Adiz said. "Your father believed in doing things the right way, even when the wrong way was easier and more profitable. That's what killed him in the end. He couldn't adapt to a world where principles were weaknesses." She looked up at Amara. "But maybe that world is changing. Maybe what you're doing will help change it." The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. The EFCC, under intense public scrutiny, couldn't afford to drag their feet or let the case disappear into bureaucratic limbo. They raided Balogun's offices, his homes, his offshore accounts. What they found exceeded even Amara's documentation. Atlantic Pearl Plaza was just the latest in a pattern spanning 15 years. Balogun had built his empire on a foundation of fraud, bribery, and intimidation. The forged documents used to seize Okoye Heights were identical in style to those used against at least 7 other property owners. Shell companies funneled money to politicians and officials across multiple states. Environmental regulations had been systematically violated in project after project. And there was something else. Something Amara hadn't known about. Something that would change everything. During the raids, EFCC agents discovered a locked safe in Balogun's private office. Inside, among stacks of cash and fake passports, they found a leather journal. Handwritten entries dating back 20 years. A personal record of every bribe, every threat, every illegal deal. Balogun had documented his own crimes with meticulous detail. Why would he do such a thing? The answer came from his former personal assistant, a woman named Blessing who had been quietly cooperating with investigators. He was proud of it, she told them. He saw it as a record of his genius, his ability to outsmart everyone. He used to read entries aloud to remind himself how clever he was. But one entry in particular caught the investigators' attention. It was dated 6 months before Chukwudi Okoye's death. Asterisk. The Okoye situation requires final resolution. The old man refuses to accept reality. His daughter studying in England presents an opportunity. Perhaps a reminder that accidents can happen anywhere would encourage cooperation. Must discuss with Emeka. Asterisk. Emeka was Balogun's head of security, a man with a reputation for solving problems that couldn't be solved legally. When Chief Williams showed Amara this entry, she felt her blood run cold. He was going to threaten me? To force my father's cooperation? It appears so. But there's more. Chief Williams flipped to another page. This one dated 2 weeks before Chukwudi's death. Read this. Amara's hands shook as she read. Asterisk. Okoye suffered heart episode after confrontation with Emeka. Unfortunate, but convenient. Property transfer will proceed without further complications. Sometimes problems solve themselves. Asterisk. What confrontation? Amara whispered. The investigation revealed the truth. Emeka had visited Chukwudi Okoye at his home, ostensibly to deliver final legal papers. But neighbors reported raised voices, then Chukwudi collapsing. Emeka had called an ambulance, but left before it arrived. The hospital recorded the cause of death as heart attack brought on by stress and existing heart conditions. No one had investigated further because no one suspected foul play. But now, with Balogun's own journal as evidence, the picture became clear. The confrontation had been deliberately engineered to trigger a heart attack in a man already weakened by months of legal stress. It wasn't murder in the technical sense, no poison, no weapon. But it was certainly manslaughter. And Balogun had documented it with cold satisfaction. Amara sat in Chief Williams's office. The journal entries spread before her, and wept. Not just from grief, though that was part of it, but from a terrible understanding. Her father hadn't simply died from stress. He'd been pushed to his death, deliberately, calculatedly. And the man responsible had written about it like a business transaction. We have him, Chief Williams said quietly. Between your evidence, the journal, and the testimonies coming forward, Balogun will spend the rest of his life in prison. But Amara, he paused, choosing his words carefully. This changes things. This isn't just fraud and bribery anymore. This is conspiracy to commit grievous harm resulting in death. The case will be bigger, longer, more painful for you. Are you prepared for that? Amara wiped her eyes. She thought of her father, of his principles, of the hope in that old photograph. She thought of all the other victims, the families destroyed, the lives ruined by one man's greed. Yes, she said. I'm prepared. The trial date was set for March. But before then, something unexpected happened. Other victims of Balogun's schemes began coming forward. Not just in Lagos, but across Nigeria. A farmer in Ogun State whose land was seized for a development that was never built. A business owner in Abuja whose company was destroyed by forged bankruptcy papers. A widow in Port Harcourt who lost her late husband's properties to fabricated debt claims. Each story followed the same pattern. Balogun identified valuable properties, created legal complications through forged documents or false claims, then swept in to resolve the situation by taking ownership at a fraction of the property's value. He'd perfected the art of legal theft. The public outrage grew. Protests formed outside Balogun's impounded properties. Lawyers volunteered to represent victims. The case that started with one waitress's courage had become a national reckoning with corruption and impunity. But Balogun still had cards to play. From his restricted movements in Lagos, he'd been released on bail, but prohibited from leaving the country. He began a media campaign. He gave interviews painting himself as a victim of a conspiracy, a successful black businessman being torn down by jealousy and foreign-educated elitists who didn't understand Nigerian business realities. Miss Okoye spent years in England, he told a sympathetic blogger. She comes back with Western ideas about how business should work. But this is Nigeria. This is Africa. We have our own way of doing things. What she calls corruption, we call relationship building. What she calls bribery, we call proper facilitation. She's trying to impose foreign values on African success. The tactic was clever. It played into existing tensions about colonialism, about African identity, about the suspicion some Nigerians felt toward those who studied abroad and returned with foreign attitudes. Some people bought it. Social media saw a backlash against Amara. Who is she to judge? Cambridge doesn't make you better than us. Let African men do business the African way. It hurt more than Amara expected. She'd thought the evidence would speak for itself. She hadn't anticipated that Balogun would try to turn her education into a weapon against her. But then something beautiful happened. The other victims, the farmers, the widows, the business owners who'd lost everything, began speaking out. They hadn't studied at Cambridge. They'd never left Nigeria. And they told their stories with devastating clarity. This isn't about African values versus Western values, said Mr. Aladil, the farmer from Ogun State. This is about a thief hiding behind culture. My father taught me honesty is an African value. Hard work is an African value. Respect for others' property is an African value. Chief Balogun doesn't represent African business. He represents greed. The tide turned again. The trial approached with massive public attention, and Amara prepared herself for the final confrontation with the man who had destroyed her father and tried to destroy her. But there was one more secret waiting to be revealed. One more twist that would shake everything. And it would come from the last person anyone expected. The Federal High Court in Lagos Island had never seen crowds like this. By 7 a.m. on the first day of trial, hundreds of people lined the streets outside, some holding signs reading, "Justice for Amara," and "No more impunity." Others simply wanting to witness history. Inside, the courtroom was packed with journalists, victims, activists, and curious citizens who'd won the lottery for public seating. Amara sat in the front row with Chief Williams and his legal team. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, her expression calm despite the storm of anxiety in her chest. Across the aisle, Chief Tun Balogun sat surrounded by his own army of lawyers, 5 senior advocates, all famous for getting wealthy clients acquitted regardless of evidence. Balogun looked different than he had at the Eco Crown Club. Thinner, older, but his eyes still held that same arrogance, that belief in his own untouchability. When his gaze met Amara's, he smiled slightly, as if to say, "You think you've won, but you don't understand how this game works." The judge entered, Justice Okonkwo, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach and her reputation for being unbribable. The trial began. For 3 weeks, the prosecution presented their case with methodical precision. They played Balogun's recording about bribing Honorable Adeyemi, who had already pleaded guilty in a separate trial in exchange for testifying. They showed the falsified environmental reports, the shell company transactions, the pattern of property seizures across 15 years. Chitty, the environmental scientist, testified about being removed from the Atlantic Pearl assessment after refusing to falsify his findings. Other officials came forward, some with immunity deals, describing the systematic corruption that surrounded every Balogun project. Then came the victims. One by one, they told their stories. The farmer who lost his ancestral land. The widow whose husband's legacy was stolen. The business owner whose company was destroyed. Each testimony painted the same picture. A predator who identified vulnerability and exploited it without mercy. When it was Amara's turn to testify, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. She described her father, his principles, his kindness, his refusal to bend even when bending would have saved him. She explained how she'd returned from Cambridge to find him broken, how she'd watched him die knowing he'd lost everything he'd built with honest work. "I became a waitress at the Eco Crown Club for one reason," Amara said, her voice steady. "To understand the man who destroyed my father. To document his methods. To gather evidence that couldn't be dismissed or buried. For 18 months, I endured his mockery. He called me simple, uneducated, beneath him. And I let him believe it, because invisible people hear everything." She looked directly at Balogun. "You thought I was nothing. That was your mistake." The prosecution then introduced Balogun's journal. Page after page of self-incriminating entries, read aloud in the hushed courtroom. The entry about Chukwudi Okoye's heart episode drew audible gasps. But it was the next entry, one Amara hadn't seen before, that changed everything. The prosecution lawyer, Bar. Chidimma Nwosu, held up a photocopied page. This entry is dated 15 years ago, before Chief Balogun's rise to prominence. I'll read it in full. Met with Chief Okoro today. The old fool wants to retire and doesn't understand what his business is really worth. His son Emeka is smarter, sees the opportunity. We've agreed to work together. The father suffers an unfortunate accident. Emeka inherits. We merge our operations, and I buy out his share at the agreed price within 2 years. He gets immediate wealth, I get the political connections and operational structure I need. Everyone wins. Except Chief Okoro, of course. But he's old-fashioned, stuck in outdated notions of honor. The new Nigeria has no room for such people. A collective murmur swept through the courtroom. Emeka was Balogun's head of security, the man who had confronted Chukwudi Okoye before his death. But this entry suggested something far darker. Bar. Nwosu continued. We cross-referenced this entry with police records from 15 years ago. Chief Okoro died in what was ruled an accidental fall down the stairs in his home. The only witness was his son, Emeka, who inherited everything. Within 6 months, Chief Okoro's construction business merged with Balogun's property development company. Within 2 years, Emeka sold his shares to Balogun for 50 million naira and became Balogun's head of security. The courtroom exploded in shocked conversation. Justice Okonkwo's gavel cracked repeatedly. Order. Order in this court. Amara felt dizzy. Balogun hadn't just built his empire on fraud, he'd built it on murder. And he'd documented it, unable to resist recording his own cleverness. The prosecution wasn't finished. We have since located Emeka Okoro, who fled Nigeria when news of this journal became public. He was apprehended last week in Ghana and extradited. He has agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony is extensive. Emeka took the stand 2 days later, a broken man. He confessed that his father's accident had been carefully staged after Balogun convinced him that Chief Okoro's old-fashioned business methods were holding back their family's prosperity. He described years of handling problems for Balogun, intimidation, threats, and in Chukwudi Okoye's case, a confrontation specifically designed to trigger a heart attack in a man whose medical conditions were known. Chief Balogun told me exactly what to say, how to push him. Emeka testified, unable to meet anyone's eyes. He said we weren't doing anything illegal, just applying pressure. When Mr. Okoye collapsed, Chief told me to call the ambulance, but leave before they arrived. To create no witnesses, no complications. He said the man's own weak heart killed him, not us. Amara listened to this with tears streaming down her face. Her mother, sitting beside her, gripped her hand so tightly it hurt. The defense tried to discredit Emeka's testimony, tried to argue the journal was fabricated, tried every legal maneuver in their arsenal. But the evidence was overwhelming. The journal entries matched dates, amounts, and events that could be independently verified. The audio recordings were authenticated. The documentary trail was undeniable. But then came the moment that would define the entire trial. Something no one anticipated. Something that would reveal the deepest layer of Balogun's rot. On the final day of testimony, the prosecution called a surprise witness, Mrs. Yewanda Balogun, Chief Balogun's wife of 30 years. The courtroom erupted in shock. Balogun's lawyers leapt to their feet with objections. Balogun himself turned white, then red with fury. You can't do this, he shouted at his wife across the courtroom. Yewanda, you can't. Sit down, Chief Balogun, Justice Okonkwo commanded. Mrs. Balogun has the right to testify if she chooses. Spousal privilege can be waived. Continue, Bar. Nwosu. Mrs. Balogun was elegant even in her distress, dressed in white lace with a gele that suggested both tradition and dignity. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. I have been married to Tun Balogun for 30 years, she began. I have borne him 4 children. I have stood beside him through his rise to wealth and power. And for 30 years, I have watched him become something I no longer recognize. She paused, gathering herself. I didn't know the extent of his crimes. I swear this before God and this court. I didn't know about the forgeries, the murders, the systematic destruction of innocent families. But I knew something was wrong. I knew the money came too easily, the properties accumulated too quickly. I knew he had become ruthless in ways that frightened even me. What prompted you to come forward now? Bar. Nwosu asked gently. Mrs. Balogun's eyes filled with tears. My daughter. My youngest, Funmaleo. She is 23, the same age as Miss Okoye. She also studied abroad, at Oxford, studying law. She came home last month and told me she was ashamed to carry our family name. She told me that true honor isn't in wealth or power, but in how we treat those who cannot fight back. She looked at Amara. I watched you on the news, Miss Okoye. I saw what my husband did to you, to your family. And I saw my own daughter's pain at being connected to such cruelty. I decided then that I could not remain silent. Some loyalties must end where morality begins. What can you tell this court about your husband's activities? Bar. Mosu prompted. Mrs. Balogun reached into her handbag and pulled out a small notebook. I kept records. Not like his journal, I didn't know about that. But whenever Tund came home drunk or boastful, whenever he spoke carelessly about his victories, I wrote them down. For years, I told myself I was being paranoid, that these were just business practices I didn't understand. But deep down I knew, and I documented what I knew. She began reading entries. Dates and conversations that corroborated the prosecution's timeline. Casual remarks about bribing officials. Celebrations of properties acquired through methods that those fools will never figure out. References to people who needed to be removed from the equation. But the most damaging entry was the last one. 2 weeks ago, before his arrest, Tun told me he had insurance. He said if things went badly, he had enough dirt on enough people to bring down half the government. He showed me a safe deposit box key and told me where it was. He said, they'll never convict me because they can't afford to let me talk. He was going to blackmail his way to freedom. The courtroom fell silent. This changed everything. Balogun hadn't just committed crimes. He'd been collecting leverage against his co-conspirators, planning to use their guilt as a shield. Justice Okonkwo looked at Balogun with unveiled disgust. Do you have anything to say, Chief Balogun? For the first time in the trial, Balogun looked truly defeated. The man who had terrorized victims, corrupted officials, and built an empire on suffering sat slumped in his chair, aging before everyone's eyes. They made me into this, he finally said, his voice bitter. Every official with their hand out. Every politician demanding their cut. Every business rival playing the same games. I just played better. I just won more. And now you want to make me the villain because I succeeded where others failed. You murdered my father, Amara said, her voice cutting through his self-pity. The courtroom had gone silent. Not for survival. Not because you had no choice. But because his property would make you richer. You destroyed families because you could. You documented your crimes like trophies because you were proud of your cruelty. Don't insult us by pretending you're a victim. Balogun looked at her with something that might have been recognition. You should have stayed in Cambridge, he said quietly. You could have had a good life there. Why come back to this broken country? Because it's my country, Amara replied. And it's only broken because of men like you. But we can fix it. We can build something better. And we start by holding people like you accountable. The trial concluded 3 days later. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts: fraud, bribery, conspiracy to commit grievous harm resulting in death, money laundering, environmental crimes, and witness intimidation. Chief Tun Balogun was sentenced to 28 years in prison without possibility of parole for the first 15 years. His assets were seized for victim compensation. His co-conspirators, including Honorable Adeyemi, received their own sentences. Emeka Okoro, in exchange for his testimony, received 12 years. The courtroom erupted in applause, something Justice Okonkwo didn't bother to silence. Outside, the crowds cheered. Victims wept with relief. Nigeria's newspapers ran variations of the same headline. Justice served. Waitress brings down billionaire empire. But for Amara, the moment felt quieter than all that noise. She stood on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, and felt only a profound exhaustion mixed with something that might have been peace. Her mother embraced her. Chief Williams shook her hand with tears in his eyes. Strangers approached to thank her, to tell her she'd given them hope that the system could work if people were brave enough to demand it. 3 months later, Amara stood at her father's grave in the quiet cemetery in Surulere. The headstone was simple. Chukwudi Okoye, beloved father and man of principle. She laid fresh flowers, white roses, his favorite, and stood in silence. I did it, Papa, she whispered. Justice took time, but it came. You were right all along. Doing things the right way, the honorable way, it matters. It costs more, sometimes it costs everything. But it matters. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Amara could almost hear her father's voice. NWAM, NWMOMA. You've made me proud. She returned to practical matters with characteristic focus. The Equity Initiative officially launched in a modest office in Yaba, funded by donations and grants from organizations impressed by her story. The mission was simple: provide free legal and financial advisory services to ordinary Nigerians facing powerful adversaries. Within the first month, they received over 300 applications for help. Land disputes, employment fraud, contract violations. Each case a reminder that Balogun had been one man in a system that enabled many like him. Amara hired other young lawyers and activists who believed change was possible. She partnered with investigative journalists. She worked with community organizations. Slowly, case by case, they began to make a difference. She also returned to Cambridge, not to stay, but to complete her PhD. Her thesis, Justice and Property Rights in Post-Colonial Nigeria, Case Studies in Legal Reform, was partly based on her experience with Balogun. It was published and became required reading in several African law schools. A year after the trial, Amara was invited to speak at a conference on anti-corruption strategies in Abuja. Standing before an audience of lawyers, activists, and government officials, she told her story again. But this time, she ended with a challenge. We celebrate when one corrupt official falls. We should. Justice deserves celebration. But let's be honest, Balogun was one man. The system that enabled him remains largely intact. The same judges who ruled in his favor for years are still presiding over cases. The same officials who took his bribes have simply found new benefactors. Real change requires more than punishing individuals. It requires transforming institutions. She paused, looking out at the crowd. I was just a waitress who paid attention. Imagine what we could accomplish if everyone in this room, everyone in this country, decided to pay attention, to document, to demand better, to refuse to accept that corruption is simply the way things work. The applause was thunderous. But more importantly, the conversations that followed led to concrete reforms. New oversight mechanisms, stronger whistleblower protections, digital systems to reduce opportunities for document forgery. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. On a warm evening in December, Amara joined a celebration in the Lekki Riverside community, the neighborhood that would have been destroyed if Atlantic Pearl Plaza had proceeded. The wetlands had been preserved, protected status strengthened. The community had come together to build a small park where endangered birds nested, where children could learn about environmental conservation. They'd invited Amara as guest of honor. As she stood watching children play, watching families gather, watching life flourish where Balogun had planned only luxury apartments for the wealthy, she felt something shift inside her. This was what justice looked like. Not just punishment for the guilty, but restoration for the harmed. Not just vengeance, but transformation. Not just one victory, but a foundation for many more. An elderly woman approached her, someone Amara recognized from the courtroom, Mrs. Adienka, one of Balogun's victims who'd lost her late husband's property. Thank you, my daughter, the woman said simply, taking Amara's hands. You gave us back our dignity. You showed us we weren't foolish for believing in honesty. You proved that truth can still win. Amara squeezed her hands gently. We all did it together. Every person who came forward. Every official who chose integrity. Every Nigerian who demanded better. That's the only way it works. As the sun set over Lagos, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Amara thought about her father one more time. About his principles that seemed so impractical in a corrupt world. About his refusal to bend even when bending would have saved him. He'd been right. Not naive. Not weak. Right. The world needed people who refused to accept that wrong was simply how things worked. It needed people willing to pay the cost of doing right. It needed people like Chukwudi Okoye. And it needed people like his daughter, who would carry on that legacy. Somewhere in a prison cell, Chief Tun Balogun faced his first of many years in confinement. His empire was gone. His family name was ruined. His legacy was one of cautionary tale, not success story. But in that Lekki Park, in the Equity Initiative office, in every person inspired to demand better and do better, in all of that, Amara Okoye's legacy was just beginning. Some victories are measured in headlines and courtroom verdicts. But the deepest victories are measured in restored dignity, in communities protected, in families who learn that honor and integrity are not weaknesses but strengths that outlast any empire built on lies. Amara's journey reminds us that brilliance isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it works quietly, patiently, gathering truth until the moment is right. Her father taught her that doing right matters more than doing easy, and she proved that one person's courage, combined with unwavering principle, can transform not just individual lives but entire systems. The path of integrity may cost everything in the moment, but it builds something that lasts forever. Like, subscribe, share, and comment the lesson you learned.